So as you guys can probably guess, this is a video about Amara and her Fist of the Elements tree specifically. I will begin with a disclaimer. It is going to be long and detailed. I'm going to try to keep most of the nonsense out. I'm going to try to not get sidetracked, but there is a lot of interplay between her skills, and I might be jumping to some of the other trees depending on what we're looking at, because there's very either potent or important synergies to talk about. So another disclaimer is this is not going to include any actual gameplay. I'm not going to be shooting anything. I'm going to be parked in this here skill tree. So the first thing we're going to look at is Phase Grass, her base ability. This is Phase Lock from Maya in Borderlands 2. It works very similarly. They recently doubled the range of all of the grab skills, so they all reach out twice as far. This has the smallest cooldown of any of her abilities in this tree. It's also the most basic and probably also the most boring. They did add another feature to all of the grabs, and that is if an enemy is immune to being lifted, they take a flat amount of damage. That amount of damage is never worth taking over any of her other tree's abilities. You'll notice this does like 7,000 damage. The immune damage is 2,000. So you'll only ever really be dealing this if you happen to be mobbing and come across an enemy that can't be lifted. Otherwise, very unimportant. It's a nice quality of life thing. It's there, fine. Moving on to a slightly more interesting version of the base ability is Eternal Fist. So this is very similar to Maya's Subsequence. If you kill an enemy while they are lifted, that lift will actually spread to an additional enemy. This can happen up to 4 times. Each time it happens, it will lift them again. However, from my testing at least, it will not reapply any of your augments. So if you have a lure, it creates a singularity. That will only happen at the first target lifted, not when this spreads. So I'd like to see some of the abilities kind of tweaked, at least for Eternal Fist, or Eternal Fist reworked in a way where maybe augments could happen again and again. I feel like that would make it much stronger and much on par with some of the other abilities that she has. But for now, Eternal Fist is kind of okay. It's a weaker version of other skills. It does have one interesting synergy that we'll talk about when we get into the skill tree. Moving on to Fist over Matter. She lifts an enemy just the same as before, except this time she summons all of the arms you see around her right now to pummel the area. This is awesome. This is really cool. However, it's very ineffective, and that is because enemies get lifted too high. The arms that are smashing the ground do just that. They smash the ground. There is a bit of AoE that comes off of each smash, but most targets get lifted too high to get hit by all of this. That being said, it will hit enemies beneath. If you use a lure, it will hit some of the enemies inside the singularity. We'll talk about that in a second, but for the most part, this skill needs to be retweaked or balanced in some way. Maybe make the explosions go vertical higher. I think that would fix it, or possibly instead of lifting the target so high, this version locks them in place. That way they're not super high in the sky. But this problem also extends to flying enemies. So there's not a whole lot of win with this skill. It's a lot harder to use. Its DPS could be amazing, but right now it's just held back on a practical scale. Moving on to Ties That Bind. This is just an absolutely incredible mobbing tool. It's, for what it does, it's her strongest skill. It just is. When she lifts an enemy, that enemy is linked to all nearby enemies via chains. Now, as far as I can tell, it does not have a limit to the number of enemies that are linked. That is absurd, because I've seen it link at least 10 people before. Like, it's hard to tell sometimes when that many people are on screen at once, but I see chains everywhere. Of all of the enemies that are linked, it shares 35% of the damage. You can already imagine that this is exceptionally good with any skill that ricochets. Brainstormer, Recursion, and all Jacob's weapons essentially, and even her skill Indiscriminate, which causes Ricochet. We'll get into more detail on that later. But just know Ties That Bind is insanely good at its base level. You'll also notice it has an 18-second cooldown. Fist Over Matter has 28. That is absurd, and we'll get into why that's so absurd in a second, because you're probably wondering, even with the ricochets, 35% is not that big a deal. It's a very low cooldown. The chains reach very far. The Eternal Fist has sort of a weakness in that its original grab range is very long. It's the same as any of the others. However, its spread from one enemy to the next is not very far. So what that ends up meaning is Ties That Bind is essentially just a better version of Eternal Fist. There's only one reason ever to take Eternal Fist, but I'll tell you once we get to the Dread skill, which you can already guess. But Ties That Bind becomes even more ridiculous in the fact that Do Harm increases the amount of damage that it spreads. So all of the stacks from Do Harm increase the action skill damage. Now, you can expect this 35% if you're using Phase Zerker and Rush stacks properly and consistently to probably have about 50 stacks of Do Harm. If you have a fully stacked Do Harm, I believe it's something like 4.5% per stack. So that's 4.5%. You're talking about at least a minimum of spreading 70 to 80% damage from this skill. That, and I've tried testing this, it's pretty difficult most of the time. I think I've seen it work a couple times, but I just can't be sure. But Laid Bare, enemies take increased damage from all sources for a few seconds after being damaged by Amara's action skill. The chains deal damage. Now, the reason why that's important is because her other main grab skills of Phase Grasp and Eternal Fist do not actually deal damage, so they can never proc Laid Bare from the Mystical Assault tree. Fist Over Matter can, but like I said, it's really unreliable currently, so that already sets Ties That Bind up and above all the other skills. So all of those chained enemies are also going to be taking 35% more damage. So at any given point while you have a target grabbed in the air, that 35% is probably going to be more like 100 to 150% damage. It's absolutely absurd. Once an enemy is linked, you might as well ignore any trash mobs, and badasses will get killed just as quick as your grab target as long as they stay nearby. The ways I think this needs to be adjusted, I don't think you adjust the chain range. I feel like that is very important for how the skill feels. I don't think you nerf the damage even, though maybe nerfing it to like 30%, just a little touchdown would probably be good. But I think you got to hit the cooldown. The cooldown being 18 seconds is absolutely unacceptable when Eternal Fist is 20 and Fist Over Matter is 28. This minimum 30 seconds on this skill, maybe 40. I probably wouldn't go higher than 40, but 18 seconds is a travesty and compared to the other skills that she has in this tree. It needs a nerf, and I'm an Amara main. This needs to be nerfed. The augment in this tree is a lure. Whenever you use your action skill, it creates a singularity that pulls enemies in. We've already talked about how it doesn't proc over and over again with Eternal Fist, so it's just not super great. Singularities in this game are not very good. They CC enemies, but they don't control them well enough for you to really put damage on them unless you're using like Blackers or rocket launchers or Firestorm, something with massive AoE already tied to it. It is a very long duration, so if you're using it for CC, it is really great, but the Charm ability is a much better version of Singularity for CC. I feel like they need to buff Singularity in Borderlands 3 anyway, just like across the board. But as it is right now, it's an okay version of a CC if you can't get to that Charm. So let's go ahead and move on to Soulfire. This changes your element damage type. Now, for Grab and Eternal Fist, that's not going to matter. You don't deal damage with them, so it won't matter. Um, it will, however, change the chain damage from ties that bind. So the damage spread from your main target or from your targets to the main source will change in their element type. So that means ties that bind is intrinsically stronger with shock as long as you go into Tempest. Now, it won't be as strong versus flesh and etc., but you know, given all enemies having equal health types, shock is generally going to be your strongest one because it's usually the first bar that they have. So you're going to clear shields instantaneously. That being said, um, fire is probably more useful if you're fighting in like super heavy COV areas sometimes, or especially like beasts and stuff. Fire's going to do you a lot better. The element type also modifies the type of damage applied by the Nimbus class mod. So Nimbus class mod will create an effect at a location. It deals damage over time. That damage is based on whatever your current action skill is. So that covers all of the ancillary skills that she has. Let's go ahead and get into the base skill tree itself. I'm going to try to move pretty quickly through this. A lot of these you already know what I'm going to touch on. I'm going to try to give some recommendations as to how to change these because I don't like just saying it's a problem, it's garbage, and then saying, oh, I don't know. So let's go ahead and get into it. Anima is a 20% multiplicative bonus to all status effects. That means ignite, melt, electrocute, etc., all of them. I don't know if it actually has an interaction with the way cryo procs, because it procs very differently than the other ones. It's not really a damage over time, but it could actually make cryo proc faster. It's a really hard thing to test though. I've tried a little bit. I have a pretty nice Shredifier that my friend gave me, and it's pretty decent to test with because it deals so little damage, but a lot of the time it happens so fast anyway that it's pretty impossible to tell. So it's a 20% multiplicative bonus. Everybody in Borderlands world knows multiplicative is always great. It also doubles the status effect duration, which is kind of nice. Most of the time you're going to be killing enemies before they fall off anyway. And if you're not, you're going to be reapplying the dot over and over again anyway. So I feel like that's a bit of a wasted stat. You can't really snipe an enemy and then walk away and let the dot finish them, at least in mayhem mode. It's just not going to work. They have more health, and a lot of the time they have like elemental down or gun down or sniper down or whatever it is, and it's just not going to matter. So you're not going to be able to one shot walk away while the world burns, unless they really change the way dots work. The final thing in this node is action skill status effect damage is increased by 40%. This is a multiplicative buff as well, and it affects, as far as I can tell, really just the Nimbus status effect. I've done some testing with the fracture skill where you shoot out hands and then there's some stuff on the ground. I don't think it actually affects the stuff on the ground. It doesn't seem to be damage over time. I didn't notice a difference with downfall, but the camera angles get wonky and stuff, so it actually might affect the beam damage per second, but I didn't notice a difference. I don't regularly use these abilities, so I'm not an expert on those, but I know that in using phase cast, I never really saw dots proc. So really what I found it to affect at least the most is your Nimbus from your class mod. One aside to that is, even though the Nimbus can proc status effects, and they are decent status effects, this is not a double dipping skill. The status effect damage does not, the base status effect damage does not affect the Nimbus Cloud. It is only the action skill status element effect damage. I was really excited because I thought it was going to double dip and be, base damage times 120% and then times 140% and have double multiplicative, and Nimbus was going to be great, but it doesn't do that. Nimbus is still okay, not compared to other things, but Onium is a solid skill overall. I would say it's almost always worth it if you're going to have elemental weapons. That being said, we're going to move on to what I would normally put in if you're not worried about dots, and that is steady hands. Amara gains weapon handling and accuracy. In this game, I had to look it up when I first started playing, but weapon handling is recoil and scope sway. So recoil is not a bad stat. A lot of guns in Borderlands 3 kind of feel good already, and accuracy is kind of an okay stat depending on your weapon type. If you're trying to like really edge out a couple different specific weapons, and then scope sway is okay on sniper rifles. The one redeeming thing about this skill is it's only a 3-point skill, and the percentages are very high. It is a lot of stats for the investment, so I would say this is usually worth it. Moving on to probably the most infamous skill in this whole tree is infusion, and if you're watching this you probably already know what it does and why it's bad, but I'll cover it just in case you don't. It converts a portion at max level is 40%, and by the way, a lot of these can go way past 5. They can actually go to like 10 skill point investments if you have the right class mod. I've seen a number of class mods roll +5 on certain skills. I don't know if all skills can do that. I'm pretty certain they can't, but I'll probably touch on that when I do like a class mod video or something. So the base max amount of this is 40%. Now the reason why that's bad is when we do elemental damage, you must match the type. If you're dealing fire damage, you really need to be doing it to flesh health. If you're dealing corrosive, you need to be hitting armor. If you're dealing shock, it needs to be against shields. Now, that being said, sometimes you can't match elements. Like if it's your grenade, it's not going to happen a lot of the time. If you're using ties that bind or any of your action skills, you're going to hit somebody with shock even if they have, armor up. If you're phase casting or whatever. So it is what it is a lot of the time, but with guns, you need to be weapon swapping. So infusion changes whatever element you have, even non-elemental, into that element, whatever your action skill element is. Right now, it would be shock. If I put on Soulfire, it would be fire. The reason why it's bad is that if I'm dealing damage with a gun, like let's say my Hellfire, and I'm shooting an enemy and I'm on flesh, that's fine. It doesn't give me any bonus. It actually hurts me in a couple ways, which we'll get into in a second, but that's fine. If I'm taking a shock weapon and I'm converting it into partially fire, you might think, hey, that's nice. It's not at all. It's actually pretty terrible, and it's only good ever if you're just that lazy. Like if you really just don't want to swap weapon types, and even then, it's going to be a net damage down. It pretty much on average will be a net down in all situations. The only time I would ever recommend this is if you're using non-elemental weapons and you know you're going to be fighting enemies with only flesh health or possibly only shield health. Like if you're fighting the Iridians or beasts or something, it could be okay. But if you ever, if you're fighting bar kids and something with armor health pops up, you're just going to get wrecked. So it is what it is. It's going to be a damage down in most scenarios. The other problem that it has is if you're dealing fire damage, if you're converting to fire damage and you already have a fire damage weapon, it's actually going to split your damage into 2 instances. So 40% of your gun damage is actually going to be taken away. So let's say you have a 1,000 damage gun. You're going to be dealing 600 damage and 400 damage 2 separate times. Now, you're probably thinking, that's fine. Like, it's still 1,000 damage. The reason why it's bad though is because status effects can only apply in one stack. So in the end, you're actually just lowering your status damage because your status damage is based on the amount of damage you dealt with a hit. And since you're hitting for 600 and 400 instead of 1,000, if you were to proc a status effect, it's going to be 40% lower. So infusion has no synergy with the tree. It feels really bad as is. I thought of a couple ways, but the only real easy way for them to fix this, in my opinion, is to take infusion and hard code each slot, each weapon slot, with a different element. So when you take Infusion, slot 1 converts a certain percentage of your weapon damage into fire. The second slot turns into shock. The third slot turns into corrosive. The fourth slot does not change at all. And then, because of that elemental problem I was talking about anyway, if you take a Hellfire and convert it to shock, even if you don't care about dots, if you're hitting a flesh enemy, you're wasting the shock portion, right? It's not effective. If you're dealing with a shield, you're wasting the fire portion. It's not as effective, so you're still going to have a damage down. I say convert Infusion to just straight up non-elemental weapons only, because that's almost always what you're going to be using it on. So you convert them into non-elemental only, and then you make them each in a slot, fire, shock, and corrosive. That way you can put on 3 Bekkas or 3 Torg weapons or any Jacob's weapon really, and you'll be able to convert them effectively and have a non-elemental elemental build or a non-elemental sniper build where you can actually scale it through this tree without having to worry about wasting points here and there. So that's all I have to say about Infusion. I know it was a lot, but this skill needs some work. Moving on to Tempest, it's a very strong, very simple buff. 30% elemental damage, 50% shock damage. That's 20% additional. So for shock weapons, this is insanely strong. For all other weapons, it's still really strong. If you're in this tree, you probably have 5 points in this. It's almost always worth it. So yeah, it's simple. Let's move on. Illuminated Fist. I guess my one critique of it is that it has the same exact problem Infusion has. It switches her melee damage into her action skill element, which means your melee damage is going to be less effectual if you're not matching health types. I think that alone makes it really bad for most builds. So I say they need to probably completely rework this skill. It can't be fixed the same way Infusion can. Possibly instead of giving a melee damage bonus of 75% and converting all of her melee damage, I would say maybe give her multiplicative bonus, like with only a 1 point investment, maybe like 20% melee damage in her action skill element, and that would fix it. But that's a very simplistic overview. Additionally, 75% seems like a lot of damage, and it is while you're leveling, but compared to like her anointments, where you get like, I think it's like 200 or 300% increased melee damage when you use your action skill, Phase Slam. And some of the other mods like you get from like shields or artifacts, 75% ends up being almost nothing. So Illuminated Fist just needs a rework completely. I don't know what they can do with it, but it is not good in its current state. Finally, in this row, we have Wildfire, and this is a weak but very cool skill. Whenever Amara applies any status effect to an enemy, it has a chance to spread to a nearby enemy. The spread range is a little small for my liking. Like most skills in this tree, a lot of the AoE range isn't very great. It has the same problem that Catharsis has down here. But it does have a really cool hidden feature. Whenever you spread a status to an enemy, it will reapply the Anima damage increase. So what that means is if I have 1,000 damage status, or 1,000 damage hit, let's say, and I proc a status effect on that. Now these are some simplified versions, and most status effects aren't the same as base weapon damage. I get all that, but let's say you deal 1,000 damage and you proc 1,000 DPS dot. So that DPS dot will now deal 1,200 damage because of Anima. If it spreads with Wildfire, that 1,200 becomes the base damage, and it will actually increase into 1,440 damage. So Wildfire actually increases the damage of outgoing dots by whatever your Anima rating is. That is actually really cool, and that's a synergy that I like to see in a Borderlands game. The percent chance is pretty low. It's not that low if you're shooting like a Hellfire, but because of the way statuses work, you always want to be doing one really big hit and applying a massive dot because you can't stack dots. This also means you're not going to be applying dots at as fast a pace as if you were shooting a Hellfire. So yeah, Hellfire would spread Wildfire like crazy. But if I'm using my Firestorm, Wildfire doesn't proc that much. Unless I'm hitting 5 enemies that are clustered together, and it can be okay sometimes, but in general, Wildfire needs a little bit of help in the spread chance. I would say bring it up to 50%. That way, with bonuses, you could get up to 60, 70, 80%. If you can get a +5 on it, it would get up to 100% chance, which would be awesome. Um, but it's a really cool skill. I think the AoE range at a minimum, even if they don't increase the chance, they need to increase the range that it can occur by about, I would say 25 to 30%. I think that would be fair. Moving on, Dread. This is the skill I was talking about with Eternal Fist. So whenever an enemy is grasped, you gain increased gun damage. It's not a whole lot. However, you can get some of these 1-point wonder skills on your comms. So your class mods can actually roll these. I think I actually have one that we can peek at real quick. I'm not going to keep us yeah, right here. It increases the dread skill and the elemental magazine skill both by 1, and those are always 1-point skills. So those can roll on class mods. I've only seen them on purples though. I don't think I've ever seen a legendary class mod with one. So anyway, back to dread. When you grab them, you gain 15% increased gun damage. That's a decent enough amount for 1 point. It does last 8 seconds. That's not too bad. The cool thing, though, is whenever a player kills a grabbed enemy, their weapon, whichever weapon they currently have, is instantly reloaded. Now, this synergizes with Eternal Fist really well because all you have to do is kill a grabbed enemy. It's not like a lure or any of the augments where it'll only proc the first time you cast it. It will proc every time you kill an enemy that is grabbed. So it has really good synergy with these two skills. This one's not that great right now, but if ever they do fix the range on this spreading and possibly increase the cooldown on this, I feel like this will be a really cool combo for sniper builds. Moving on to the next, we have Indiscriminate. This is one of her coolest DPS increases. Amara's bullets that hit have a chance to ricochet and deal decreased damage to nearby enemies. Unlike the other skills, this has really respectable range. This can ricochet very far distances. I've seen it ricochet all over the place. Baseline, it gets a 10% chance per level. That gets up to 30% chance. I know there's indiscriminate on some class mods. I googled it and at least it said there was. I don't think I've ever gotten one, so don't hold me to that. But also notice the ricochet damage does not increase when you level this skill. So base bullets have a 30% chance to ricochet for half damage. When you have an enemy grabbed with Phase Grasp or Stillness of Mind, they will have an increased chance, double, and they will also only lose 25% of that damage. Now, that's actually insane because that's when you're going to be wanting to do your DPS. When you lift an enemy, that's when you want to do damage, which is why Amara's anointments are really bad for this tree, but we'll probably get into that in a different video. Deep Well, very simple bonus. Amara gains increased magazine size with elemental weapons. It's a 20% bonus for 1 point. Sometimes with small magazine weapons, that'll give you an extra point. With bigger magazine weapons, it will help a little bit. It's not bad for 1 point, especially if you can get it on a class mod. I wouldn't think too much about taking it or not. I would really depend. I would make that decision depending on what else you're trying to get in the tree, and this is a last resort kind of skill. But if you want bigger mags, take it. Catharsis. I'm going to go ahead and skip over this for 1 second because I want to cover another skill first. And it's a skill that sort of enables Catharsis to be possible at all. And then we'll talk about how they work together and how right now they're just really bad. So I'm going to go ahead and skip down to Conflux. This is like just the coolest ability. I was so excited to use this. Whenever Amara applies a status effect to an enemy, she gains a chance to randomly electrocute, ignite, or melt that enemy. That is not the kill effect. Like a lot of people have thought like that's when you like electrocute an enemy and they fall down and they're dead. It's not an instant kill. That is the name of the statuses. So if you hit somebody with fire damage and it procs the damage over time, that's called an ignite. So this is the shock, fire, and corrosive version of those. Now, it also says whenever Amara applies a status effect. It does not say those three, it's any status effect. So you can be dealing radiation damage, and this was sort of my dream, is to hit somebody with like a really big radiation proc, and then it also starts procking electrocute, ignite, and melt, and I have 4 damage over times rolling on enemies. Now, the chances of conflicts occurring are pretty low. And this is sort of the same problem Wildfire had, where if you're using the weapons intended for statuses, like sniper rifles or bigger hitting weapons, anything that doesn't split pellets, that kind of stuff, it's actually going to be very difficult to get conflux rolling. Conflux is actually meant to be used, in its current state at least, on stuff like Hellfires, where you have really high shots per second and really high dot chances. So I can go through one magazine and proc all the statuses. There's a big problem with this though. The conflux damage is not based on weapon damage. It is based on the level that the game is set to, I believe, and it might be your level. But I think those two things are most of the time interchangeable. I think it's probably the host's level +1 or something. So conflux will proc dots based on that. Now the scaling on that though is horrific. They just deal almost no damage. If you're using a Hellfire, they're not even half, each one of the procs is not even half of a Hellfire proc, let alone if I'm shooting with like the Firestorm or God forbid the Recursion, who has like way higher dot damage. So conflux is almost never worth it in a dot centric build. It's actually a decent DPS increase if you have like really high firing weapons where you don't care so much about the actual dot damage, you just want a little bit of help. And you can proc all of them at the same time, and it helps a little bit with shields, it'll help a little bit with corrosive. It's not worth a 5-point investment though. Like that's the problem with this skill. With its current DPS output, I would say this is no more than a 3-point investment. And I wouldn't even consider it good if it was still a 35% chance. I would say it would have to be bumped to like a 50% chance minimum, and then 3 points I still probably wouldn't take it. It needs, in my opinion, to scale with weapon damage. That way, if you want to do a Hellfire, you'll still get some good procs. Not necessarily weapon damage, I'm sorry, dot damage. So Hellfire, for instance, has a really high multiplier on its damage over time effects versus its actual damage per bullet. So conflicts would work really well with those kind of weapons. They would still be trash for snipers that couldn't apply them unless you increase the chance. So something has to be done to it. I think it should probably scale off of dot damage of the weapon. That being said, I wouldn't be adverse to it just that being the only change to it, and then you would get like a +5 conflux class mod or +3 conflux if you're using a sniper just to get those procs off, those big meaty procs. I think it would be worth the trade-off in that case. Now that being said, that actually enables another skill to really be possible at all. Let's move to it now, Catharsis. When Amara triggers any status element on an enemy, they are basically doomed to explode when they die. They explode for whatever her attuned element damage is, so fire, shock, or whatever, along with any other element that is currently inflicted upon that enemy, so any statuses that are on them. So if you have conflicts, you're going to be able to proc all the statuses, and they'll explode one time for each of those. This skill has a short cooldown. So if we run through the numbers, I believe this scales up to 960 damage if you max it out. And you'll deal 960 damage. Let's round it to 1,000 just for ease of use. Let's say I'm using a radiation weapon with conflux and I have procced 4 statuses on an enemy. That's about the most you're going to be able to do. Let's say cryo also counts and I have like a cryo grenade. So I've procced 5 of them and I'm using a specific weapon with 5 points in conflux, and then I max Catharsis out. That's an 8-point investment. Now, the damage on that is going to be 5,000 damage, and that's not horrific. However, you're dealing that after the enemy is already dead. It is a very small AoE. It very rarely hits other enemies, and it has an 8-second cooldown. This thing is bad in almost any direction you look. It needs to have its AoE probably increased by 50% at least. Like, it's a very small one. And if they're going to keep that cooldown, maybe 100% increased AoE size. And then the damage itself is not very respectable, just because in order to get that damage out, you have to invest in Conflux as well. I would say, given the nature of Catharsis, it should probably just be one proc based on her attuned element damage, and don't let it proc any of the others, and just make it a much bigger damage amount. That way you don't have to go into Catharsis and Conflux. I think for a 3-point investment, like a 3,000 or 4,000 damage proc would be kind of okay if the AoE was bigger. The cooldown is unacceptable. Just 8 seconds is just way too long for any skill to have a multiple point investment. Like, this needs to be a 1-point skill with its full scaling in its current state. I don't recommend ever taking it. It looks cool, it really does, and it sounds pretty good. Sometimes you can actually see the explosions happen separately if you're not in the middle of mayhem, but it's a very cool thematic skill. In every practical usage, it's terrible. It's on the level of infusion, in my opinion. It's just a waste of points. Moving on to another ray of light in the tree, and there's been a couple. Like, basically all along this left side here, we've had some great skills, and it continues with sustainment. Elemental weapons, not grenades or your class mods or anything like that, not your action skills, just your weapons gets 20% elemental lifesteal. Very strong. It is a big investment. However, later on, your weapons will probably outscale your health, kind of like in Borderlands 2. So you may get away later on with putting like a 2-point investment in here. So sustainment's a really great skill even now, but you kind of have to invest 5 points, and you can't go with like a deathless build if you go into sustainment. The final thing to note is forceful expression. This is your capstone. It is extremely boring for a capstone. I've noticed in Borderlands 3 a lot of the time they are. Most of them are still strong though, and this one is too. So Amara's guns deal bonus elemental damage. Bonus elemental damage, or bonus damage in general, is a multiplicative increase. So you can basically read this skill as deal 18% more damage. Now, you won't always be dealing exactly 18% because it is based on your action skill element. So that action skill element will be fire or shock or whatever. However, that is increased by any sort of elemental damage bonuses that we have. So that 20% is already based on a lot of multipliers already. So it is a very strong bonus, and in certain situations it can be very, very nice to just trim down some stuff, because you'll notice some enemies might have more shields or more health depending on what type they are. And if you really wanted to ignore shock damage, for instance, and just get down to their meat because their shields are really weak, you could do a shock action skill element and then use forceful expression to kind of trim that down with like a normal weapon or a fire weapon or something, and you wouldn't have to weapon swap as often. That being said, it's still less optimal. But it is always going to be a nice multiplicative damage increase. If I have missed anything in these trees, let me know. There is a lot of synergies that are left to cover. I kind of didn't want to cover them. So if you're thinking, well, wait a second, Ties That Bind is absolutely insane when you mix it with Soul Sap. I know that there's a lot of things, but I want to cover those when I get to the other trees. But yeah, leave comments or descriptions or links of anything that I missed or misrepresented, because I'm still learning too. I just wanted to share some of my thoughts, opinions, and my testing with the rest of you guys. So I think that's it for now. Later.